Gospel according to Mark, the 7th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the traditions of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'The people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human traditions.'" Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. To give you a moment for centering these words from Isaiah 64. "O Lord, you are our Father, we are the clay, and you are our potter. We are all the work of your hand." I don't know about you, but I don't have a long bucket list, as they call it. I did have one thing at the very top of my bucket list, which I accomplished last year, and that was to give my wife a kiss on the Eiffel Tower for our anniversary. Check. As for other things, one thing that I would like to do sometime before I die is to throw a pot on the wheel. Take a lump of clay and work it into something. That would be, I think, really awesome to do. And having never done it, I've seen it done, and I know that for it to happen the way it's supposed to happen, that piece of clay has to be centered on the wheel. And when it's centered, then the potter can form it into a vase or a bowl or a platter or whatever it is, and it is a thing of beauty. But if that clay gets off-center and things start to wobble, then they all come apart, and it is not any longer what it was supposed to be. I think from this morning's reading out of Mark, Jesus makes it clear that the hearts of people have gotten off-center. So with apologies to Jesus and Isaiah, whom he quotes in this morning's passage, let me rephrase one of the things he said. "This people honors me with their lips, saying that their lives are centered, but their hearts have slipped off-center and are rapidly wobbling out of shape." That's my own take on what's going on. The religious leaders of Jesus' day were busy, in Jesus' view, focusing on secondary matters. They had put things of secondary importance in the center of the wheel and allowed what was most important to slip off entirely. And Jesus is now trying to put back into the center what belongs there, and that is a life of faith that demonstrates his love of God by sharing that love with other people. It's that simple. And Jesus was a real threat to the status quo. And you get a sense of that by the presence of the Pharisees and the scribes. The scribes are the ones who carry around all these traditions to make sure they're accurately provided to the next generation. To get an idea of how serious a threat Jesus was to them, you realize that Jesus is doing what he's doing in this reading up in Galilee, in the north. And if you were to hop into a car today and drive from Jerusalem to Galilee, where Jesus was, you could do it in about 2 hours. But in Jesus' time, it took about a 6-day walk, which meant that these guys had given up the better part of a month to to track down Jesus, keep an eye on what he was doing, so they could criticize him all along the way for the ways that he was threatening the status quo. It's amazing the lengths that people will go to keep things the same. Change is always challenging. And I'm sure by now you've all heard the classic Lutheran joke about change. How many Lutherans does it take to change a light bulb? Change! You said change. Well, okay. Challenges to institutions bring fear. Challenges to individuals bring fear. We may be living in a certain spot that's horrible. The better place is out there, but it's unknown, so it's feared, and change is not welcome. And institutions look for ways to preserve themselves and protect themselves from change. It's true in Jesus' day, and it remains true in our day too. There's a wonderful little book that was published maybe 15 years ago. Some of you may have read. It's called Reclaiming the L Word. And in this case, the L word is Lutheran. It's written by Kelly Fryer, who was a pastor in a Chicago area church. And she tells about 5 stories to illustrate how her church came to 5 guiding statements to help them remember who they're supposed to be. The 5 statements are: Jesus is Lord, everyone is welcome, love changes people, everyone has something to offer, and the world needs what we have. It's a great book. Those are great guiding principles. And if I can remember correctly from the presentation she gave, the story that she tells that helped them formulate the first one, Jesus is Lord, went something like this. In the particular church she served, the piano, which was up in front, was making access to the altar difficult. So the church council decided that they would move the piano. And they decided to move it one night during church council meeting. Why it became the church council's responsibility to move the piano, I don't know. But apparently word got to the music director that this was happening. And as the council entered the building to move the piano, the music director raced in and jumped on top of the piano and held onto it as if to say, over my dead body, are you going to move this thing? That gave rise to the question, who's Lord in this church? Is it Jesus or not? Well, every church has its sacred cows, its traditional ways of doing things, and if you violate those rules, you do so at your peril. Now, I've been at Trinity I haven't been at Trinity long enough to learn if there's any sacred cows, or if I have violated them, you've been nice enough to me not to mention it. But I know from experience that every church, I won't say every church, many churches, it's said of the Lutheran Church, there are the 7 last words of the Lutheran Church. We've never done it that way before. I don't know if that's true here or not, I hope not. But I know I've been in places where it was true. One church I served, if you should dare to put the wrong food in the fireside kitchen refrigerator, oh my gosh, it's like you'd spit on the Ark of the Covenant. And when I was an intern, I wasn't even a pastor yet, my supervisor let me decide to install garland in the narthex instead of a Christmas tree in the sanctuary. That never happened again. I'll tell you that. And so, related to this, every church is littered with invisible signs that are clearly visible to the people who know how things work, but they're invisible to the newcomer. And if you're new, too bad. The church I most recently served had 2 handicap spaces out behind the church. But the door closest to the church, the door closest to those parking places in the church, didn't have a handle on the outside. The invisible sign on the door said, if you really knew what you were doing, you'd go around to the front and come into the church. And God forbid you were a first-time visitor to that church, and it was a warm day and the door was popped open, and you decided that you were a little late, and you decided to come to church, and you rolled into that door, it would be like coming in this door in the middle of the service, and suddenly you're in front of everybody. Oh my gosh, that would be awful. So as a church, we always have to be aware of keeping Christ at the center of our Trinity heart wheel, if you will, so that we can be molded the right way. And in that regard, I'm really grateful for the work being done right now. I hope you know about it, by what's called the MET team, Mission Exploration Team. This is part of the work of preparing for the call of a new pastor. And they're doing exactly what has to happen to keep Christ and the mission that Christ is giving this church at the center of the wheel, so it doesn't wobble off or get replaced with stuff that doesn't belong there. Because if we think of our hearts as the wheel that the potter is using, it's Jesus who has to be at the center of that. But it's possible for us easily to let Jesus slide off the center, and have other things placed in there, all kinds of things. Jesus gives us quite a list this morning in the passage from Mark of the things that threaten to take that center spot. Everything from fornication to folly and everything in between. But I wonder if he were present in our midst in America today, if as he talked about the list of things that can occupy center space that don't belong there, if he might not talk about some of our political ideologies and our even extreme nationalism that goes on. If he were to consider the devotion, sometimes the rabid devotion, that both liberals and conservatives give to their causes, I wonder if he might say something to each side along the lines of what Joshua was heard to say last week. Choose this day whom you will serve. Because it seems to me that maybe, just maybe, you've pushed me off the center and allowed something else to take that center place on your heart's wheel. And I've run into people, nobody at Trinity, but over the years, who give the impression, well, I'm sure if pressed they would never say this, who give the impression that their commitment to America is in the center and has pushed aside commitment to God and God's kingdom. One example that comes to mind, in a church that I served, there was an American flag up in the chancel, up by the altar. And it was suggested that that flag be moved to right at the edge of where the people sit, the nave. Because the flag represents some, if not all, of the people in the sanctuary. But it was felt that nothing should compete with the cross for our attention in the front. I was taken aback by the strong reaction to such a suggestion. It made me wonder what's going on here. And at its most extreme, I think there are people who feel like America, it's a great country, I wouldn't live anywhere else, but that America is the end destination of the promises that God made to fulfill in the book of Genesis, when God said, I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. Jesus ran into that kind of an attitude. I think he might say, whoopsie, you forgot the last part of that very important verse, which says, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. In other words, if God blesses a nation, if God blesses the United States of America, it's so that they will become the pipeline so that God's blessings flow to everyone else on the planet and not just kept for ourselves. But of all the things that can occupy the center of the potter's wheel, the most common is, drumroll, wait for it, me. And I don't mean Pastor John in your lives, I mean in each of our lives. The number one original and still number one way we do this is to put ourselves right in the middle of our heart's concerns. Look out for number one. It's all about me. It's what Luther called the original sin of being curved in on yourself. That's what we always put in the center of our heart's wheel. But here's the thing. If we put ourselves in the middle of the wheel, that clay is going to wobble and come apart. But God never throws away clay that has wobbled off its center. God goes to work and puts it back together. Now, having mentioned all this stuff about the potter's wheel, is there anybody in the room who's done that before? All right, somebody throws a pot. Somebody's thrown a pot. I looked at 12 YouTube videos yesterday to watch how this is done, and one thing I noticed in every single case, there's the wheel, there's the clay, there's the hands, but next to the wheel, there's always a vessel filled with what? Water. Water. The potter always keeps the clay wet so it can be worked. And I hope you see a connection with your baptism here. Because as God continues to shape and reshape us, we're always kept wet. Years ago, scientists discovered these strange-looking towers of dirt in the middle of the desert where there was no water in sight. They were termite colonies that stood 8 or 10 feet in the air. How did they stay alive when it's so dry out here? They knocked one down and they tunneled underneath it 65 to 70 feet to find out where they found the water table, and they brought the water back up so that if it was wet in the colony, things stayed alive. So stay wet, my friends. Remember your baptism. It may not be your habit to stop at the font on the way out to make yourself a wet cross, but I would do that today just to remember that the potter always has his hands on you to reshape you, so that at the center of our hearts stays Jesus all the time. And he's kept there through gathering like God's people today in prayer and song and scripture, in word, in meal, in getting wet again. He keeps his place at the center of our heart's wheel. Because again and again, the clay gets misshapen, it falls apart, and again, the potter reshapes the clay. The world had tossed Jesus off into the waste bin as a piece of unworthy and unusable clay. But the Father put him back in the center when he raised him from the dead. So that splash of a wet cross, the taste of bread and wine, puts us again in connection with the death and resurrection of Jesus and puts him at the center of our hearts once again.